The war were learned at grievous cost in French blood, and it would be the responsibility of the army's leadership to ensure the continuation of this knowledge that they had learned, and not allow idealistic new young officers who had not the personal experience of the horrors that misguided creativity could result in to ignore these lessons and forget them, that they'd paid such a cost to learn. Lesson 2. Flesh, fortified by elan and aggression, seems to lose out when faced with lead, fortified by machine gun fire and artillery. Firepower was now, quote, the preponderant factor of combat. If you were going to win, you needed more firepower. If you were on the offense, you needed ludicrous amounts more firepower. You needed 3 times the infantry, 6 times the artillery, and 15 times the ammunition. Lesson 3. Fortunately, the French had figured out how to manage firepower. General Debonnais's performance at the Battle of Montdidier, 8th of August 1918, the Black Day for the German army, was a textbook example on how an army could effectively coordinate all this firepower. Lesson 4. The next major war was not going to be a comme tu vas affair. It was going to be a major combat of national resources, total war over a number of years. The side that would win would be the side that would be best able to leverage all its resources available to the nation and beat the leverage of resources of the opposing nation. So this now provides us the opportunity to segue over to some of the larger national issues which controlled French military development after the war. I mentioned earlier that the British and the Germans looked at how to configure the militaries to win battles and campaigns. Well, the French started off with the larger question of how do we win the next war, and then they modified everything below that to suit. The French military, as a result, was designed not to win battles, but to win wars, which actually led to a little bit of a liability. So, for example, 1935, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the question was, well, should we invade as a result of this? And the head of the French army spoke to the politicians and said, look, we got a problem. We can't do small wars. We can do a complete national war because that's what we're configured to do, and we can just go all in, or we do nothing. There's no middle ground. So anyway, if one is to presume that the next war is a clash of national might and resources, the important thing here is the effective long-term mobilization of that might, the mobilization of manpower, the manufacturing materiel, and so on. The purpose of the peacetime metropolitan army, i.e. the bit of the army that's in France proper and not off in colonies or the islands, their function is to buy time for the nation's well-planned and organized mobilization structure to field the army which would then defeat the opposition. When it came to the manufacturing of materiel part of the equation, though, France had a very significant problem caused by geographic bad luck. France's manpower and industrial capabilities were actually a little bit less than those of Germany, so they realized that every single bit counted and had to be as efficient as possible. However, France's resources, such as iron ore, for example, which you would need to make the steel to make the materiel, are all on the German border. And about 80% of France's industry at the time was within 100 kilometers of Germany. And that was because you built your factories, your smelters, whatever, where the resources were. And that means that your factories are now right next to the German border. If France attempted to trade ground for time or for maneuver space for mobile units, you ran the risk of these factories, this absolute key component of your war-winning capability, falling into German hands. And France was very worried about what was known as the attaque brusquée, which is basically a German rapid thrust. So they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose their industry in that initial rapid thrust while the French military is mobilizing. So if French battles had to be tied to the key terrain of the industrial areas and no retreat was possible if you wanted a long-term victory, the only solution is to prevent the Germans from making any significant penetration of the border at all in the first place. The logical conclusion of this now would become the Maginot Line. Fortunately, the terrain belongs to a lot of the French-German border was such that defensive fortifications actually were generally practicable and would work. But the takeaway I want you to get from this is that the idea of the Maginot Line wasn't exactly faulty thinking or fortress mentality or lack of vision, but it was basically forced upon France by the geographic realities that it faced. At least if you believed that the next war was going to be a total war fought by mobilized nations, which, as it turned out, it was. Just France wasn't partaking in that bit of it. Your next problem is that of manpower. The war is going to be fought by the nation's manpower as a whole. Fantastic. So every man capable of service would be conscripted for a period of time for training before being released back into the civilian workforce. In wartime, they'd be called to the colours. But unlike, let's say, post-war conscription as we may know it now, especially those of you maybe my age, you do your time, 2 years, whatever, then you get out and then you forget everything. These French reservists, once they'd done their time of conscription, they will be called back in at intervals for refresher training. This thus made sense a couple of ways. Firstly, to meet the requirements of winning the war of its nation under arms, right? You need your personnel. This makes sense. Secondly, it made some political sense, which brings us to the next large issue facing France, and that was the relationship between the politicians and the military. The French government was not the most stable in the world in the interwar period. In fact, they had 43 prime ministers between 1918 and 1940. At the most extreme, Edouard Herriot was prime minister for 3 days. His successor, Raymond Poincaré, 6 days. Almost no prime minister lasted a year. So this meant that any continuity of political support for directed policies was difficult, to say the least. Secondly, the nature of the government, regardless of which actual name was in charge, was not particularly favourable to the military as a whole, because they were basically all socialists. Ever since the Dreyfus affair in the 1870s, the army officers were viewed as a whole, being rather conservative, monarchist, and, gasp, Catholic. The governments, though, were Republican, socialist, and to put it mildly, they did not trust the army's leadership at all. And it absolutely refused to put itself into a position where the military could launch a coup. A lot of decisions seemed to be made on the basis that the French army were actually a bigger threat to the Republic than the Germans. For example, the commander-in-chief of the French army in peacetime had absolutely no power or authority whatsoever, because that way he couldn't launch a coup. He would be granted those powers in warfare, which arguably might be a bit late. Now this, in theory, was countered by the fact that the politicians in charge would be able to do the coordinating and giving the guidance if they so desired, which unfortunately they generally did not. A, because he had the turmoil at a higher level, and B, because oftentimes the ministers of war, which actually in fairness there were only 4 or 5 of them, they viewed a lot of these issues of doctrine to be purely technical matters, and they simply left it in the hands of these councils of generals who only could do so much. So the people who wanted to do it weren't allowed to, and the people who were allowed to generally didn't want to. Further, the French government had absolutely no intention of letting large numbers of men remain under the influence of senior French officers. So a professional army, well, that's a coup waiting to happen. And even if you left conscripts under the influence of these reactionary generals for too long, then, well, you never know. They might become contaminated with these strange ideals and launch a coup. So they wanted to keep the conscription term as short as possible as well. So the French army now has a mandatory minimum requirement for its defense of a certain size and won't let the professionals do it, and they don't want the conscripts to do it. So this started a whole lot of argument over the next 10 years or so over just how long you could conscript somebody. And, well, since long-term military service wasn't proving incredibly popular with the electorate anyway, well, this all seemed to suit very nicely to the idea of shortening conscript service. This leads to the next problem facing the military. An army which is predominantly made of reservists, which trains from time to time, cannot easily change doctrine. Because let's say you got this guy who's been out of uniform for a while, and you bring him back in for 3 weeks of service. It's barely enough time to knock the rust off of what he was originally trained in, let alone trying to train him in something entirely and completely new. And training the professional units wasn't going to be all that fantastic either, because the professional units were the core of the reserve. So you take, let's say, a professional division. In time of war, it will be split up into 3, and each third of the division would be used as the nucleus around which a new division primarily made of reservists would be created. So, train as you fight wasn't going to happen. Now, this pretty much has set the parameters around which the French military could work. So now let's have a look and see what actually happened within these parameters. And so we go back to the lessons of World War I, and in particular the exemplary performance by General Debeney with his structured, focused and synchronized application of firepower to just break the German line. The infantry was still going to be the core, la reine de bataille, the queen of battles. The French use the same term we do. But combined arms is the name of the game. Every asset available, artillery, tanks, aviation, you name it, they'll all be brought together in one place to support the infantry. But to do this effectively requires planning and control. And this will become the root of the French military doctrine in the interwar period, la bataille conduite. In English, it translated as the methodical battle, although it probably is better translated as a combination of methodical, driven, as in steered or controlled. A commander's role in this is to determine where to place the effects of his fires and then maneuver accordingly. And maneuver in French doctrine at the time, it doesn't mean just moving things around on the map or on the battlefield. It means a combination of movement and fire. It's actually the same as current US definition of maneuver. In this, the most important part of the commander's firepower is the artillery. And it's almost like the most important thing that the commander could do was decide what the artillery was going to do next. And any attempt to decentralize artillery was strongly objected to in doctrine, because what this meant was that if you devolved control of your artillery to lower echelon commanders, you have just disarmed yourself and lost control of the fight. You've lost your influence. But in order to do this effectively, you had to have good communications and a good overview of the battlefield. Hence the idea of commanders being set a little bit back. Now, what the commander was supposed to have and what he actually had in 1940 don't necessarily match. But bear with me, so far the theory is still sound. In this concept of the methodical battle, the tank is simply another method of putting fires on target. So the tank, as a result, is not an independent arm. Now, General Estienne, the father of the tank, who was made the inspector of tanks, actually didn't have very much authority on his own. He had enthusiasm, he had vision, but he had no particular authority. Development of tanks actually belonged to the Directorate of Artillery until 1928, and then it got transferred to the infantry after that. Now, actually, this might have worked out okay, because Estienne was a little bit Fulleresque in some of his thinking about masses of armor with basically only aviation as support. But we'll come back to Estienne a little bit later. Some moves towards the concept of the total war actually did happen in 1920. There was a proposal for additional state authorities in the next war to do things like conscript women and to seize private assets for the national need. This did not go over well, and indeed it would be a very watered down version of this law which would pass in the mid-1930s, 15 years after the law was originally proposed. And you'll see this, the French take forever to make a decision in this interwar period. Also, in 1920, new regulations start coming out. So an infantry manual in 1920, and then 1921, the provisional instructions on the tactical employment of large units comes out. The basic gist of this, which works out happily enough given the French disinterest in starting a war, was that the French army would be assumed to be on the defensive at the beginning. The enemy would bleed themselves against the French defenses because you had that issue of firepower ratios. And then the French would take over in the methodical assault against the weakened enemy. And the French were not entirely defensive. I mean, they realized that you cannot win a war by sitting down and being purely defensive. You have to go on the offense, but they weren't planning on doing it immediately. Discussions also started around this time over the issue of conscription, I mentioned a little earlier. And although in the interwar period it started out as being 2 years, it dropped down to 18 months and then down to 1 year. It would eventually in the 30s go back up to 2 because of the birth rate issues, but we're not there yet. Now, the details behind the big arguments are within the scope of this, but the bottom line was that the professional officers said, look, we need a professional force of about 150,000 men to do everything that we need to do, to defend the frontier, to train the reservists and so on. And the government were not giving them that big a force. The government said, no, you can have 100,000. And now that you have reservists coming in every 6 months, basically, so you'd have a 1 year term of service, you have a 6 month cycle of the first batch, and then the 6 month of the second batch. When the 6 month of the second batch are up to speed, the first batch get released, while the second batch are holding the fort, shall we say, and then the third batch comes in. As a result, the professional French soldiers are spending more time training reservists than they were doing anything, professional soldiering. Anyway, back to the tanks. France ended the war with 2 types of tank. The light tank, which basically was the Renault FT, of which it had about 3,500, and the heavy tank, which was about 400 Schneiders, 400 Saint-Chamond, and about 100 British Mark Vs. Now, of these, we can discount the heavies, because the Schneiders and the Saint-Chamonds were basically useless, and the British Mark Vs, well, they had issues of their own. So this means, firstly, that whatever the French did with tanks, it had to be something that the FT could do, could mechanically be capable of doing, because they had a hell of a lot of them, and they weren't about to go spending the money replacing them anytime soon. And secondly, because that was the only tank that they effectively had. There was no heavy tank. 1920, a new manual comes out, provisional instructions on the employment of tanks as infantry weapons. And what it basically did was exactly what it said on the front cover. Tanks were not able to occupy or conquer terrain alone. Okay, that's reasonable enough. It was American doctrine up until a couple of years ago. And they were only going to aid the disposition of the infantry.